The cabin interphone system allows the flight crew to communicate with the cabin crew, or for the cabin crew to communicate amongst themselves. When the cabin transmission key on the ACP is pressed and the cabin reception knob is selected on, the flight crew can talk to the flight attendants using either the boom, mask, or hand microphones. The cabin attendants use their cabin attendant handsets. The service interphone system allows for communications between the cockpit and cabin stations and the service interphone jacks. There are 7 interphone jack locations on the exterior of the aircraft. On the overhead service interphone panel is a push-button service interphone override switch, normally left in the auto position. This allows the system to be used when the aircraft is on the ground. When the aircraft is raised off its landing gear, the service interphone system may be used if this push button is selected to the on position. The audio lines from the interphone jacks are connected to both SIDS directors. The ground mechanic call system allows the flight crew and ground crew to call each other in order to establish communications. The mechanic push button on the overhead calls panel is pushed to advise the ground crew that the flight crew wishes to communicate with them. When the push button is pressed and held, the blue cockpit call light on the external power panel illuminates and an external horn sounds. Select the mechanic calls push button. When the push button is released, the horn stops, but the light remains illuminated. The light remains illuminated for 60 seconds, but it can be extinguished at any time by the reset button on the external power panel. The cockpit call push button on the external power panel, when pressed, sounds a buzzer on the flight deck, and the mechanic light on the ACP flashes amber. When the push button is released, the buzzer stops, but the mechanic light on the ACP remains illuminated for 60 seconds. The flight crew can extinguish the light using the reset push button on the ACP. The cabin call system allows the flight crew and the cabin crew to call each other in order to establish communications. If it is desired to communicate with the flight attendants, the forward, mid, exit, or aft push button on the calls panel is momentarily pressed. Select the forward attendant call button. A red light comes on at the corresponding cabin area call panel. Captain call and a green light comes on at the attendant indication panel, and a high-low chime sounds through the area loudspeaker. The flight attendant then picks up one of the handsets to respond. When a flight attendant wishes to call the flight deck, the captain push button on the handset is momentarily pressed. Select the captain push button on the flight attendant handset to call the cockpit. In the cockpit, the attendant light will flash amber on the ACPs and a buzzer will sound. Note, the buzzer is inhibited during takeoff and landing. The light will flash for 60 seconds or until the reset push button is pressed on any ACP. To respond, the flight crew can press the attendant transmission key and select the cabin reception knob on the ACP. In the cabin, the captain message will appear on the attendant indication panel, AIP, for which the captain key was pressed. The emergency call key triggers oral and visual alerts in the cockpit. The on light flashes in white, and the call light flashes in amber. The attendant lights will flash on all ACPs. 3 buzzers, inhibited during takeoff and landing, will sound consecutively. In the cabin, the emergency call message will appear on all ACPs. When the emergency push button on the overhead panel is momentarily pressed, the call light will flash amber and the on light will flash white. 3 high-low chimes are heard through the cabin loudspeakers. A red light flashes at all area call panels in the cabin, and emergency call is displayed on all AIPs. Select the emergency call push button. The passenger address system allows the pilots or the flight attendants to communicate to the passengers over the cabin loudspeakers. The flight crew may make an announcement using two methods. The first method is to use the cockpit handset located on the end of the center pedestal. It is removed from its cradle, and the press to talk button is held in while the announcement is made. The second method is to use a boom, mask, or hand microphone with the ACP. The PA reception knob is pressed on, the volume is adjusted, then the PA transmission key is pressed and held while the announcement is made. Select the PA reception knob and the PA transmission key to make an announcement.
Please try.
Note that the PA in-use light is illuminated green when the PA is activated from the cockpit or cabin, when the videotape reproducer, VTR, is running, or when the video server is running. When the guarded evacuation command push button on the overhead emergency evacuation panel is pressed and released, the on light comes on, the evacuation light flashes red, and an evacuation horn sounds in the cockpit. In the cabin, the evacuation horn sounds, and the evacuation lights at the forward and aft flight attendant panels flash. Pressing the horn shut-off button silences the horn in the cockpit only. When the evacuation command push button is pressed off, all lights and sounds in the cockpit and cabin will cease. The captain and purser switch has two positions. In the captain position, the evacuation alert may only be activated from the flight deck. If a cabin evacuation push button is pressed, the cockpit horn will sound for 3 seconds. In the captain and purser position, the alert may be activated from either the cockpit as described or from the cabin by pressing the command push button at the forward or aft flight attendant panel. In the cockpit, the evacuation light on the command switch flashes red and the evacuation horn sounds. In this lesson, we have discussed the Audio Management System, Cabin Intercommunication Data System, SIDS, controls, interphone system, call systems, passenger address systems, and the emergency evacuation system.